I've carried this story around for almost 20 years, and I still don't know whether writing it down is an act of confession or self-preservation. For obvious reasons, I'm using a fake name. You can call me William. The crime I'm about to describe started with a typo. At least, that's what everyone called it at the time. A harmless mistake in a will. One misplaced line among dozens of pages of legal language. Something nobody thought twice about. But that single line changed everything. Back then, I was 32, broke, drowning in debt, and angry at the world for reasons that felt justified to me at the time. My grandfather had recently died. He was the kind of man who measured affection in silence, and believed money solved every problem. When the family gathered for the reading of his will, everyone expected a straightforward division of assets. Instead, confusion spread across the room. According to the document, ownership of a valuable piece of land, worth far more than anyone realized, had been assigned to the wrong branch of the family. My branch. The lawyers assumed it was an administrative error. My cousins argued it was impossible. My aunt nearly walked out of the room. And me? I sat there pretending to be surprised. The truth is that I knew something nobody else knew. 3 weeks before my grandfather died, I had seen an earlier draft of that will. The land wasn't supposed to go to us. The moment I realized that, a dangerous thought entered my head. If a simple mistake could transfer a fortune from one person to another, what would happen if that mistake became impossible to correct? At the time, I convinced myself I was only curious. That was the first lie I told myself. Many more would follow. After the reading of the will, the entire family went into damage control mode. Lawyers exchanged emails, relatives made angry phone calls, and everyone seemed convinced the issue would be resolved in a few days. What nobody realized was that I already knew more than they did. A month earlier, I had helped my grandfather organize some paperwork in his study. He was old, stubborn, and refused professional assistance whenever possible. During that visit, I accidentally came across a folder containing draft versions of his estate documents. One version clearly showed that the land was meant for my cousin Daniel. The final version said otherwise. At first, I assumed the discrepancy would be corrected immediately. But after hearing the lawyers debate whether the final signed document would override previous drafts, I sensed an opportunity. I started researching inheritance disputes late at night. Hours turned into days. The more I learned, the more I understood how much depended on documentation. That was the moment greed began replacing curiosity. I stopped asking whether the situation was right or wrong. I started asking whether it could be used. Looking back, this is the point where it became a crime instead of a temptation. For several days, I told myself I was only gathering information. That's what I repeated whenever my conscience started making noise. But deep down, I already knew what I wanted. If the earlier draft disappeared, the final signed will would become much harder to challenge. The problem was that I didn't know where those documents were being kept. Through casual conversations with relatives, I learned that my grandfather's attorney was still sorting through boxes of records collected from the house. Most family members were focused on arguing over the land itself. Nobody seemed concerned about old drafts. That gave me confidence. I visited the attorney's office under the pretense of delivering some family photographs for the estate file. The visit was completely legitimate, which made it the perfect excuse. While there, I paid attention to everything: filing cabinets, storage rooms, staff schedules, even which employees left their desks unattended. I wasn't acting yet. But I was preparing. And preparation has a way of making terrible decisions feel increasingly reasonable. Once I started planning, I became obsessed with details. The attorney's office wasn't some high-security facility. It occupied the second floor of an older building, and most of the staff had worked there for years. They trusted people. They trusted routines. Most importantly, they trusted me because I was one of the beneficiaries involved in the estate. Over the next 2 weeks, I found excuses to stop by several times. Sometimes I brought documents. Sometimes I asked questions about probate timelines. Once, I even dropped off coffee for the receptionist. Each visit taught me something. The receptionist took lunch at exactly 12:30. One assistant left early every Thursday to pick up her children. The storage room containing archived files was usually unlocked during business hours because employees were constantly moving boxes in and out. I noticed these things the way a hunter studies a trail. That comparison still makes me uncomfortable. At the time, though, every weakness I discovered felt like proof that fate was helping me. I wasn't thinking about consequences anymore. I was thinking about access. And I was getting closer to it. The day I crossed the line didn't feel dramatic. There was no thunderstorm, no last-minute warning, no sudden realization that I was becoming someone I wouldn't recognize later. It felt like an ordinary Thursday. I arrived at the office carrying a folder filled with completely legitimate estate paperwork. The receptionist greeted me by name. The attorney was in a meeting. Everything unfolded exactly as I hoped. While waiting, I asked if I could use a conference room to organize my documents. Nobody objected. From there, I slipped into the hallway leading towards storage. My heart was pounding so hard that I was sure someone would hear it. Every footstep sounded too loud. Every opening door felt like a disaster waiting to happen. The storage room was unlocked. Inside were dozens of boxes labeled with client names and dates. Finding my grandfather's records took longer than expected. For nearly 10 minutes, I searched through stacks of files, terrified that someone would walk in. Then I found the box. For the first time, the opportunity wasn't theoretical anymore. It was sitting right in front of me. I remember staring at the box for several seconds before touching it. Up until then, everything had been planning, observing, and imagining. Opening that box meant committing to something real. Inside were folders containing correspondence, financial records, notes, and multiple versions of the will. My hands shook as I flipped through them. Every rustle of paper sounded deafening. Then I saw it. The draft I remembered. There, in black ink, was the version naming Daniel as the future owner of the land. It was exactly as I had seen it weeks earlier. If lawyers found it, and connected it to other supporting records, the argument that the final version contained a mistake would become much stronger. For a moment, I hesitated. I actually considered putting everything back and walking away. But greed has a remarkable ability to silence hesitation. I removed the draft and several related notes, folded them into the folder I had brought with me, and carefully reorganized the box so nothing appeared disturbed. A minute later, I was back in the conference room. Outwardly calm. Internally, I was panicking. I thought the hardest part would be taking the documents. I was wrong. The hardest part was acting normal afterward. I sat in the conference room for another 15 minutes, pretending to review paperwork while the stolen documents rested inside my folder. Every conversation in the hallway made me think someone had discovered the missing files. Every ringing phone sounded like the beginning of an investigation. When the attorney finally met with me, I could barely focus on what he was saying. I nodded at the appropriate moments and answered questions automatically. Then something happened that nearly ended everything. As I was leaving, one of the assistants mentioned that they were conducting an inventory of archived estate records later that week. She said it casually, almost as small talk. My stomach dropped. An inventory meant someone might notice the missing documents sooner than I expected. The drive home felt endless. I kept checking my mirrors, convinced I was being followed despite having no reason to believe it. That night, I spread the documents across my kitchen table. For the first time, I truly understood what I had done. The documents sat on my kitchen table until nearly 3 in the morning. I read them over and over, searching for anything I had missed. Every page reinforced the same conclusion: if these papers resurfaced, they could seriously weaken my family's claim to the land. The obvious solution was to destroy them. Yet even then, I couldn't bring myself to do it immediately. Part of me feared that once they were gone, there would be no way back. As long as they existed, hidden somewhere, I could still pretend I hadn't fully committed. It was irrational, but that's how my mind worked at the time. For 2 days, I kept the documents locked in a metal box in my garage. Then news reached the family that the attorney's office couldn't locate certain records related to the estate. The search had begun. Panic finally pushed me into action. Late that evening, I burned the papers in an old steel drum behind a storage shed owned by a friend. I watched every page curl into black ash. The relief lasted only a few minutes. Then the guilt arrived. And it stayed. A week after the documents disappeared, the atmosphere around the estate changed. At first, the missing records were treated as a filing error. People assumed the papers had been misplaced during the transfer of materials from my grandfather's house. But as more searches turned up nothing, frustration started turning into suspicion. Family members began asking questions. The attorney called several beneficiaries, including me, to see whether anyone had copies of older drafts. I answered calmly and said no. Technically, it wasn't the first lie I'd told during this mess, but it was the one that bothered me most. Daniel took the situation especially hard. I remember meeting him for coffee. He looked exhausted. He said he was certain our grandfather had intended the land to go to him, and couldn't understand why supporting documents had vanished. Listening to him was uncomfortable. Not because I feared getting caught. Because I knew he was telling the truth. For the first time, I had to face the fact that there was a real victim sitting across from me. Not a legal obstacle. Not a rival claimant. A person. After that conversation with Daniel, I should have confessed. At least that's what I think now. Instead, I did what many guilty people do. I built a story that allowed me to live with myself. I told myself that my grandfather had signed the final version voluntarily. I told myself that maybe he had changed his mind at the last moment. I convinced myself that the missing documents weren't the reason my family would benefit. They were merely removing confusion from an already valid decision. The more I repeated those arguments, the less convincing they became. Still, I kept repeating them. Meanwhile, tensions inside the family grew worse. Relatives stopped speaking to one another. Holidays became awkward. Every gathering turned into a debate about money, fairness, and inheritance. And through all of it, I played the role of innocent observer. That role became harder to maintain when rumors started circulating that someone might have intentionally removed the records. The possibility of theft was no longer being whispered. People were saying it out loud. And every time I heard it, my pulse jumped. Just when I started believing I might get away with it, something happened that shook me harder than anything before. The receptionist from the attorney's office called me. It wasn't an official call. She wasn't accusing me of anything. In fact, she sounded friendly. But during the conversation, she casually mentioned remembering one of my visits around the time the documents disappeared. My chest tightened immediately. Then she said something I hadn't expected. She remembered seeing me near the storage area. Not entering it. Not leaving it. Just nearby. To anyone else, it was a meaningless observation. To me, it felt like a spotlight. For days afterward, I replayed the conversation in my head. Had she told anyone else? Had investigators asked her questions? Did she suspect something and simply choose not to say it directly? The uncertainty was unbearable. Fear began changing my behavior. I avoided family discussions. I stopped answering some phone calls. I became overly cautious about everything. Ironically, the more I tried to look innocent, the more suspicious I probably appeared. Guilt was starting to control my life. Months passed, and something strange happened. Nothing. No police officers showed up at my door. No attorney accused me. No hidden evidence suddenly surfaced. The questions that had consumed everyone slowly began to fade. The missing documents remained missing. Eventually, the legal dispute moved forward without them. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt trapped. For nearly a year, I had lived with constant fear of exposure. Every unexpected phone call made my stomach knot. Every unfamiliar car parked near my house caught my attention. I had become so accustomed to expecting disaster that I didn't know how to function without it. Then the final ruling arrived. The land stayed with my side of the family. Just like that, the fight was over. Relatives who had spent months arguing suddenly moved on with their lives. Some remained bitter, but the legal battle itself was finished. Everyone celebrated. Everyone except me. Standing among smiling family members, I realized something uncomfortable. I had achieved exactly what I wanted. And the victory felt hollow. The money remained. The satisfaction didn't. People often imagine that getting away with a crime feels like freedom. For me, it felt more like carrying a weight that nobody else could see. The legal battle was over, but the story didn't end there. Years passed. The land was sold, investments were made, and the money changed several lives, including mine. From the outside, everything looked successful. Inside, it was different. Every time the inheritance came up in conversation, I felt a flash of discomfort. Whenever someone described the outcome as what Grandpa wanted, I had to resist the urge to leave the room. The worst moments involved Daniel. He never stopped believing a mistake had been made. Occasionally, during family gatherings, he'd mention the missing records and wonder aloud what had happened to them. Nobody had answers. I did. And I sat there in silence. The strange thing about guilt is that it doesn't stay the same. It evolves. The fear of being caught gradually faded, but something else replaced it, the realization that I had permanently altered other people's lives for my own benefit. That thought never completely disappeared. About 15 years after everything happened, I came closer to confessing than ever before. It happened after a family funeral. Several relatives gathered at a restaurant afterward, sharing stories about the past. At some point, the conversation drifted toward my grandfather and the inheritance dispute. Most people treated it as ancient history. Daniel didn't. He was older, calmer, and far less angry than he had been back then. But he still remembered every detail. I listened as he talked about the missing documents and how their disappearance had changed the course of his life. Then he said something that hit me harder than any accusation could have. He said he no longer cared about the money. What bothered him was never knowing the truth. Not revenge. Not compensation. The truth. For a moment, I seriously considered telling him everything. I could feel the words forming in my throat. My heart was racing exactly as it had years earlier in that storage room. But I didn't do it. I stayed silent. And when the moment passed, I knew it probably wouldn't come again. So that's my confession. I was never arrested. I was never formally accused. As far as the law is concerned, the missing documents simply vanished somewhere along the way. I got away with it. At least that's what most people would say. The older I get, the less I believe that. When I was younger, I thought consequences only mattered if they came from courts, police officers, or judges. What I didn't understand was that some consequences move into your head and stay there. They become part of your identity. For years, I viewed myself as someone who made one bad decision under financial pressure. Now I see it differently. I made hundreds of decisions. Every step offered a chance to stop. Every lie required another lie behind it. The theft wasn't a single moment in that storage room. It was a chain of choices that I willingly continued. If anyone reading this is standing at the beginning of a similar path, don't trust the voice telling you that one small act won't matter. It will. And sometimes the person you end up deceiving most completely is yourself.